Hello, I'm Paul McGeary, and this is Democratic Dialogue. Our guest tonight is Jim Henderson of Voters' Choice MA, a group that is behind an effort to bring what is called ranked choice voting to Massachusetts. Jim, welcome to the show.
Pleasure being here. Absolutely.
Nice to meet you. Why don't you tell us first a little bit about yourself and how you got into Voter Choice Massachusetts, and then we'll go into what ranked choice voting really
Absolutely.
is.
So professionally, I'm an attorney. I have my own law practice, been practicing law for just shy of 30 years at this point. But I've always tried to be involved politically in some form or another. I've worked on campaigns of various sorts. But about 15, 20 years ago, I came across this reform known as ranked choice voting, and it struck me as a way to better promote democracy in general by promoting ideals of majority support for candidates in races of all sorts. And so I began working with a variety of people in different forums and have written op-eds and have just done general work in support of ranked choice voting. And then when Voter Choice Massachusetts got ramped up about a year ago, I joined that group and have been active with it over the past year.
And you are currently the treasurer. Right?
I'm the treasurer. I'm on the board of directors of Voter Choice Massachusetts. Also serve as the head of the Speakers Bureau. So I do gigs like this and help others do as well throughout the state.
Good. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about what ranked choice voting is exactly, and
Sure. So let me tell you first, before I go into the mechanics of ranked choice voting, tell you about some of the problems that we're trying to address in our voting system. So we've seen in a variety of races around the country and occasionally here in Massachusetts, the concept of spoiler candidates. When I do presentations, we often look back to the 2000 election in Florida, where we all remember George Bush and Al Gore and Ralph Nader, where you had a candidate, Ralph Nader, who pulled a very small percentage of the vote in that particular race down in Florida. And it's often perceived that he tipped the election toward George Bush. And there's reasons to believe that had people voted, been able to list a second choice, they might have listed more likely Al Gore over George Bush. And there's exit polling to that extent. And so there's this concept that candidates can be spoilers in races, where by having more than two candidates, one candidate can take just a little bit of the vote and prevent a more popular candidate from winning.
And there have actually been occasions, I believe, in the past where the opposition has essentially put up a stalking horse candidate for the express purpose of knocking off.
Right. There was a race in Massachusetts last week that, maybe arguably didn't have, the effect of a spoiler, but it was a state Senate race where there were three candidates. Paul Feeney, who won the race, a Democrat, a Republican, but then a third candidate, Joe Shortsleeve, who many people remember was on Channel 4, was a reporter on Channel 4, and he actually pulled almost 10% of the vote in that race. Mm-hmm. And Paul Feeney won with a plurality, about 47% of the vote. Now, maybe here amongst Democrats, we would cheer that result, but we don't know that Paul Feeney actually had majority support in that race. So arguably, Joe Shortsleeve may not be a spoiler, but he pulled 10% of the vote. Where did those 10% of the voters, where would they have made their second choice? So that, again, that's the concept of spoiler candidates that we often hear about. Another reason to think about ranked choice voting is the concept of vote splitting. And so we have cases where we have more than two candidates running in a particular race. Let's take the gubernatorial primary in the Democratic Party back in 2014. You had three particularly strong candidates. You had Martha Coakley, you had Steve Grossman, and Don Berwick. Now, Martha Coakley won that primary with about 42% of the vote. Yet it's pretty much understood that Steve Grossman and Don Berwick were more closely aligned politically in their politics. And had there been an opportunity to rank their ballots, it's often believed that most of Don Berwick's voters, Don having come in third place in that race, would have chosen Steve Grossman rather than Martha Coakley. And so we have a circumstance where arguably the Democratic Party, by not supporting a system that allows, to recognize the majority supported candidate, put up a weaker candidate against Charlie Baker in the general election. There was an article in the Boston Globe today, just to take a flip side to this. about the Republican race to put up a nominee against Elizabeth Warren for Senate next year. And there are a number of candidates in that race. And there was a report that one of them was trying to get another candidate drop out of the race. And the argument being put forth there is that there is a candidate in that race who's very supportive of Donald Trump, and then a couple of more moderate Republican candidates. And there's the concern in that race that the moderate candidates might split the moderate Republican vote in their primary to allow the Trump supporter to go ahead and win the race. And so we see this this concept of vote splitting not just in a Democratic situation, it happens across the board. Another example I look back a couple of years ago was in the Boston mayoral primary, where there were a lot of candidates of color, which was a watershed moment for Boston, yet they split the vote. And in that primary, it was the two white Irish guys who went on to the final election, even though almost 40% of the vote were for candidates of color. Mm-hmm. And ranked choice voting is a mechanism that would solve both the spoiler issue, to allow more candidates to run without people worrying about someone winning a race that they don't want, and also solves the vote splitting issue.
Well, I think this might be a good time. I know you've brought a little film with you.
Right.
And I think maybe we'll run that film now, and then we can come back and explain in some detail the mechanics of ranked
and just
choice
to
voting.
set this up, there are a number of cities around the country that are using ranked choice voting now. One of them is the city of Minneapolis. They're in fact going through a mayoral election now. And a couple of years ago, as they were preparing for their RCV election, they prepared this video to explain how ranked choice voting works, both from the voter's perspective and mechanically. If we could run that video now, that'd be great.
This was done for the benefit of the voters in Minneapolis.
Absolutely.
This was the first time they had done this ranked choice voting?
I believe so, yes.
Oh, good. Okay, so why don't we run that now, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about the mechanics of it.
Sure.
It's called ranked choice voting. Here's an example of how it works. All of the candidates will be listed on the ballot in 3 columns. Make your first choice vote in column 1 by filling in the oval of the candidate you'd most like to win. Vote for your second choice in column 2, and make your third choice in column 3. That's all there is to it. Now let's see how the votes are counted. Let's say there are 4 candidates running for mayor: Asha, Zach, Omar, and Lucy. Once the polls close, we count all the first choice votes first. To be elected mayor, a candidate needs more than half the votes. In this example, Asha has more than half of the votes, so she's declared the winner. However, if no candidate gets more than half the votes, we start eliminating candidates and counting the next choices of those who voted. In this example, Zach is the candidate with the smallest number of first choice votes, so he is cut. We use the second choice votes on Zach's ballots and count those voters' second choices instead. If one of the remaining candidates now has more than half of the total votes, that candidate is declared the winner. If not, the next lowest candidate, Lucy, is eliminated. Her votes are now counted for the next choice on the ballot. Some of Lucy's votes went to Zach, who was already eliminated, so those new votes for Zach instead count for those voters' third choice candidate. We are now down to 2 candidates, and Omar clearly has more than half of the votes. That makes him the winner. That's how ranked choice voting works.
So, having now seen that video, we can see how, in the case of 4 candidates in that example, when someone, if you don't get a majority of support along the first choices, that you drop out a candidate. And you do that process until a candidate gets majority support.
So it's an iterative process. It's not one and done. It's, as in the case of the film, there was one candidate. The remaining 3, no one of them still had a majority.
Yeah.
So then you dropped out the second one. What was interesting was then the first candidate's votes that had gone to the third place candidate were then redistributed as well.
Exactly. And again, the underlying concept here is that you're trying to elect somebody with true majority support. You want the candidate, whether you're representing a city as a mayor or a state as a governor or as a representative in Congress, you want to make sure that that person is representing the majority voice from that community. Our current system doesn't guarantee that. And again, we see numerous circumstances, and it has happened here in Massachusetts, but we can look at Paul LePage up in Maine, who never won his race for governor with a majority of the vote, and arguably never would have. Yet he has been in a position to operate as governor of that state. And I think to support the general concept of lowercase d democracy, the idea of knowing that the majority voice of the community should be heard rather than some small portion that manages to consolidate sort of power within a plurality but not a majority of our communities.
Now, one of the things that I'm sure you face is we do have a tradition in the United States of winner take all, even if it's less than a majority. But there are places, and I know Cambridge is one, where this has been in existence for some time. How did it come to be in the places like Minneapolis and Cambridge? How did you overcome, or how did the proponents of ranked choice voting overcome that sort of, well, this is the way it's always been?
Right. Well, I mean, there's nothing in our voting systems that technically requires a voter, a winner-take-all, a first-past-the-post system. It's simply, you're right, it's the way that we've been doing it for a long time here in the United States. And I think in a lot of these circumstances, you've seen organizations such as Fair Vote on a national level who've been promoting this ideal of majority support in the communities, looking at the problems, again, the vote splitting of smaller candidates, but also the idea of greater voter choice. And so you've seen in these communities, whether it's been Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota, Cambridge has been doing ranked choice voting for its city council for 60 some odd years. Portland, Maine elects its mayor through ranked choice voting. It's been used in a number of cities in California. And the overcoming that hurdle is, again, reaching out to the voters, reaching out to the people in their jurisdictions, and making them realize that if they truly want to have their voice heard, we need to have systems that bring more people in, that recognize that we want to have more people running for office, that we shouldn't have a system where candidates are discouraged or penalized because they want to run. And again, the first-past-the-post system has this perverse effect of penalizing additional candidates. And again, whether we look at that at the party level, at the primary level in any party, so we'd all like to see more candidates run. But in general here in Massachusetts, we have so many races for state legislature that are uncontested, and we have this almost culture of discouraging people to run for office. And a ranked choice voting system encourages people because it allows, it provides the candidates with the comfort knowing that they can reach out to voters and not be have pushback in terms of the spoilers, but allows the voters to truly vote for who they want. In the sense that in a ranked choice system, as you saw in that video, you get to rank the candidates in the order of your preference. And so if I like candidate A more than candidate B, but I like candidate B too, I don't penalize candidate B because I like candidate A first, particularly if I really dislike candidate C.
Right, because in that case, your vote for candidate A could end up being a vote for candidate C.
Exactly. And again, we are in a system, first past the post really is almost forces people to play games with their votes. And rather than having to gamify the system and try to figure out who is most likely to win, all right, I better vote for that person, allow the voters to truly express their own opinions in the ballot booth without the penalizing effect of first past the post.
And as you know, the winner take all is not, as you say, enshrined in the Constitution.
No.
Senators used to be elected by state legislators.
Of course.
So there is a history, both in this country and outside this country, of having changed the mechanics of electing public officials, and it's in place. And I know there's a graphic on your website, which is voterchoicema.org.
Yes, exactly.
That shows where it's in place in many levels of elections throughout the country. I know Maine now has it statewide for...
Right, so Maine enacted it through a ballot measure last November. So the people of Maine stood up and said, we want to change our voting system, and they enacted ranked choice voting. again, ranked choice voting is not a new concept. It's been in place in Australia for over a century in their parliamentary elections. It's been used in numerous countries. And again, you mentioned Cambridge. Again, 60 some odd years where they've been using ranked choice voting. For many of these, counting the ballots by hand. They don't need to do that anymore. But they have consistently wanted that system in place because it allows the voices of the entire community to be heard at the city council level, not just, again, a set plurality.
And in terms of a parliamentary government, it ensures, I would think, that you get away from the sort of fragmented coalition governments that are essentially powerless because they can't command a majority on major issues. Here you would probably, I would think, in most likelihood end up with a majority government.
Well, but even if you don't, you are encouraging the people who are elected to office to hear the voices of all their supporters. One of the great benefits of ranked choice voting is that it actually promotes positive campaigning. It actually, if a candidate goes up there and simply trashes all the other candidates, they may get the first choice votes of their core supporters, but they're not likely to get second choice votes beyond that. And we found in elections, again, the current mayor of Minneapolis remarked that in her election, while there were some elbows thrown, people were generally positive because they wanted to get second choice votes because they knew that they were not likely to get a majority on the first ballot just because of the number of candidates running. And so those second choice, even third choice votes were going to be really important to make sure they got elected. And so candidates will go out there and profess what they support rather than simply knocking down the other candidates. But they also learn when they get elected that they got votes from this other group of people. So you could picture whether it might be a Green Party or a Libertarian Party or maybe a particular ethnic group providing support. It'll help guide those representatives, our representatives of government, to govern not just for the little group of people that may have voted for them in a first-past-the-post system, but from a more broad coalition.
So if I'm elected after going through this process, and I know after round one, the Green Party candidate's vote went overwhelmingly to me as opposed to the numbers two-person or whatever, then that's part of whom I now represent because I understand. I mean, you represent everybody, but it also shows me what the issues were that were important that got me elected.
Exactly. And if you ignore that, next time you run for office, those candidates or those voters will probably remember the fact that you didn't recognize that. Mm-hmm. And it'll have an effect on our system. I'd like to think that with ranked choice voting, we would see a little bit more moderation, again, or a little more introspection as to how our representatives work in government rather than being almost forced to
beholden to a fringe group.
Right, exactly, and have this great wedge between different edges of the political spectrum that people will find a little bit more common ground. There's actually a proposal that's been put forth at the federal level by Fair Vote, I mentioned them earlier, that would promote the idea of multi-candidate congressional districts. So here in Massachusetts, we have 9 congressional districts. The idea that we might have 3 congressional districts that would elect 3 members of Congress each through a ranked choice system. And so what it might end up happening is that you might end up electing, I know, a couple of Republicans from Massachusetts to the Congress, but they're not likely to be fringe Republicans. And likely the Democrats are going to be sort of more likely to be, again, representative of the general electorate, maybe not the sort of extreme edges. But that would happen in other states as well. And so you could pick out your favorite Republican state and where systems are currently gerrymandered against, you could look at Wisconsin where they've gerrymandered the system very much against the Democratic Party. If you were to implement a system such as what Fair Vote has proposed, which again uses a ranked choice system, you're more likely to get representatives that are more numerically related to the actual allocation of voters, as it were.
That haven't been systematically excluded by the first-past-the-post system.
Exactly right.
Now, as we look ahead to 2018, I know there are a couple of elections upcoming right here in Massachusetts. primarily in the primaries.
Yes.
Both the 3rd Congressional District, where Nikki Tsongas is retiring, and then on the Republican side, there's a large field vying to compete against Elizabeth Warren.
Right.
How would ranked choice voting work in these cases, both primary elections as opposed to finals?
Right, exactly. So I'll look back to the 2007 race for the seat that Nikki Tsongas currently holds. There are 4 or 5 really well-regarded candidates for that race. And Nikki Tsongas won that primary in the Democratic Party with 37% of the vote. Now, maybe she was the one that would have had majority support, but we don't know. And the system would have been better had we known that Nikki Tsongas or some other candidate had gotten majority support. Right now, there are about 6 or 7 people who've openly said they're going to run for that open seat next year in the Democratic Party. Is it possible that the winner of that race would win under our first past the post system with, 25% of the vote, without knowing that person actually had majority support? And I think the last thing that anybody, whether you're a Democrat in the Democratic Party or a Republican in a Republican primary, wants to do is put up the weakest candidate ahead. Again, there are candidates running against Elizabeth Warren. And again, it's possible that because of the vote splitting circumstance I described earlier, that a candidate who is supported by a very vocal activist minority within the Republican Party might be put up against Elizabeth Warren. Now, again, Democrats might say, hurrah. But again, from a political perspective, we should be, again, recognizing who is supported by the majority of the voting public involved. And I'm sure that the Republicans would look and say, we want to put up our best candidate, much like the Democrats want to put up their best candidate for their race. And if you look at the 3rd Congressional District, there will certainly be viable Republicans running in that race. And I'm sure the Democrats want to make sure that they have the best candidate. On the first past the post system, if there are 6 or 7 candidates running, we can't be assured of that. Ranked choice voting would make sure that the candidates running in the 3rd Congressional District for the Democratic nomination would be reaching out to the entire district, maybe not just looking at Haverhill or Lowell or Lawrence. They'd be looking at the entire district to make sure that they got support throughout the district. And I think that's a really good, a good approach in our democracy.
Well, and you see it at presidential races now where, the Democratic candidates don't go to red states because there's no percentage. You can't win them. So, but with the ranked choice system, perhaps if there's 3 candidates in the race, they become more attractive.
Absolutely. I mean, if we ever got to a national popular vote system for president, I mean, the Electoral College is a whole separate issue, and I won't go down that rabbit hole here. But certainly, if you had that system, every vote would be important, and every voter would be important. In the sense that you'd want to go, if you're a Democratic candidate, you wouldn't just find your small group of Democrats. You'd want to find the independents, Green candidates, maybe even moderate-leaning Republicans these days, because there'd be a value in that. Right now, with the first past the post system, it's find your group and sort of ignore others.
And I know on your website, which again is voterchoicema.org.
I love it, yes.
You have maps that show where this system is in place, and it really is. It's as much as it seems different from the way we do things. There are a lot of places in the United States where it is done both at the party level and at the municipal level, and as you say in Maine, it's now statewide.
Exactly.
So that there is precedent for this. There are places where it works. Tell me about California.
Right. So again, it's done principally at the municipal level in California. Again, Maine's the first statewide place, but they've been using it now for a number of election cycles in San Francisco, in Oakland. There was a really interesting mayoral race in Oakland a number of years ago where you had, which really exhibited how ranked choice voting works, because you had one candidate, a principally right-wing candidate, who campaigned very normally. Essentially, he trashed everybody else along the way, and he had his group of supporters. And he actually, in the first round of that ranked choice voting, had the plurality. I can't remember the percentage, but let's say he had 40%. There were a number of candidates running. But all the other candidates, more liberal, progressive, however you want to describe it, had campaigned more positively, had sought out those second choice votes. And what happened is that the fellow who had taken the negative approach didn't get many second place votes and did not win. And the thing that has been shown.
Do you recall, did he make it into the final, or was he eliminated?
No, it was a single race. And see, that's another great benefit. I'll go down this path here about ranked choice voting, is that you could actually get rid of preliminary elections.
Oh, that's right.
You could actually take all the candidates, rather than having to get to a final two to a general election, you could get rid of a primary election, save the cost of having a preliminary election, and just have everybody go to the general ballot in a ranked choice system and make sure that the candidate gets a majority support. And beyond the fact you save the cost of the preliminary election, you get people engaged in the election that everyone shows up for. And again, the Boston mayoral primary back at the end of September had very low turnout because people just don't think about voting in September. They will in November, and there'll be a higher turnout for that race in November. But wouldn't it be great if we actually had all the candidates have the chance to be exposed to the larger electorate that comes out on election day in November?
Well, we recently went through that in Gloucester. We had a preliminary election because there were 3 candidates. Unfortunately, one of whom has since died. But at the time, it was clear that there was no hope, and yet we were forced to hold it at the expense of a preliminary election just to eliminate one of the 2 candidates.
Exactly. There are a couple bills currently pending before the state legislature right now that would enact ranked choice voting in a couple forms. One would be a local option bill that would give cities and towns the option to use ranked choice voting for their elections, which, if that were the case, Gloucester could have chosen to get rid of the preliminary election and just had the 3 candidates in the general election and run it that way. And one of the key sponsors of that bill is my state senator, Jamie Eldridge. There's another bill that would enact ranked choice voting on a statewide level. So there are currently efforts right now at the legislative level here in Massachusetts to enact ranked choice voting. We'll see where they go.
Well, as someone who has been in preliminary elections in the past, you have to put so much effort out just to get to the starting gate, and then you've got to do it all over again. It would be better, I think, for both the electorate and those elected to focus on that final election, and also focus, as you say, on broadening the base.
Exactly.
Because that's going to be the key to winning that final election.
And again, it's better for the voters.
Well, we're almost out of time, but I do thank you for coming, and I think this is a very important issue. Again, voterchoicema.org.
You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/voterchoicema, and also on Twitter at, guess what, at voterchoicema.
I know you're making the rounds now and you're going around. Are there any other events coming up that people who are interested in ranked choice voting might?
We have events all around the state. We're talking to various Democratic city and town committees around the state as we speak. We certainly encourage people to come out and lend a hand. They can go to our website. They can sign up for a mailing list, find out what's happening here in the North Shore and elsewhere in the state. If you want to volunteer, we love volunteers to help go out and find more people. We may be looking toward a ballot measure in 2020, and we'll certainly want to have a good number of folks who are inspired by the idea of ranked choice voting to come out and help us make that a reality.
Great. Well, thank you, Jim. This has been very illuminating, and I thank you for coming in to visit with us today on Democratic Dialogue.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Good night.